The Netherlands are without a doubt the greatest nation that never won the World Cup. They participated in 3 finals and lost them all, despite having players like Cruyff, Neeskens and Robben in those editions. How could that happen? Were they cursed by a Dutch hitting German? Or are just they bottlers? Many of you seem to think they have failed simply due to bad luck, but today we're gonna put that to the test and finally come to a definitive conclusion on why the Netherlands haven't won the World Cup and will most likely never will in the near future. Make sure to stay until the end, because the answer will surprise you. So for starters, we gotta travel to 1974, the year where the Dutch participated in their first World Cup since 1938. And ironically, they were actually quite lucky to even make it to this tournament in the first place, since they qualified on goal difference, but in their final group game against the Belgians, Jan Verheyen had a perfectly good goal ruled out for offside. Had it stood, the Dutch would have been eliminated. Either way, such a long absence would never make them favorites to win the tournament, but the Dutch came into this World Cup with a different football philosophy that shocked everyone. Led by Rinus Michels and Johan Cruyff, the Netherlands introduced the world to total football, where in short, the team would attack and defend as one. That strategy confused everyone, and their opponents didn't know how to counter it yet, so despite being clearly underdogs, the Netherlands made it all the way to the final, racking up emphatic wins over Argentina, Brazil and Uruguay. At that point, Cruyff and his teammates were seen as rock stars, but on the flip side, they were also living like rock stars. Just 5 days before the final, the Dutch were living their best life, having pool parties with local women. Quite a stark contrast to their final opponents, West Germany, who had won the Euros in the previous year and had a solid disciplined group with stars like Beckenbauer, Breitner and Müller. It was a stacked matchup, but the Netherlands weren't phased and scored the first goal of the match without even letting the Germans touch the ball. However, they weren't able to contain the Germans, and by halftime, Die Mannschaft had already conquered the lead. In the second half, the Dutch looked like shadows of themselves. Their ideas were no longer present, and they seemed desperate to score, punting long balls after long balls to no avail. In the end, the Germans won, and I can call them lucky on this one. Just like a religion, the Dutch had their own football faith, and they were willing to die for it. Their first goal was to play their way, and it cost them the World Cup. Admirable, but impractical. The next lost final was just 4 years later in 1978. Although Cruyff had helped his country qualify to the World Cup, he retired from international football in the previous year after a kidnap attempt. There aren't many controversial episodes regarding the Netherlands in this World Cup. They made it all the way to the final with merit, but their opponents, well, not so much. It was indeed one of, if not the dirtiest World Cup of all time, where the Argentinians were blatantly favored, and although you can't say much about them bending the rules in the final, they made their home crowd even more raucous by arriving late to the field and questioning the legality of René van der Kerkhof's plaster cast. But the moment that the Dutch will never forget was when Rob Hansenbrink's shot hit the post in the dying seconds of the match. Had that ball gone in, the Netherlands would have been world champions. Instead, they went to extra time with the score tied, and the Argentinians would score 2 goals to win the World Cup. In this scenario, it's hard not to call them unlucky. Although as professional football players they had the obligation of not falling to mind games, missing a goal-winning chance by millimeters in the last second is bad luck. Following this loss, the Netherlands fell off massively and spent most of the 80s out of international tournaments. They would make a comeback by the end of the decade and win their only major international trophy in Euro 1988, and 2 years later they were back in the World Cup, but also back to their unlucky ways. In the most boring World Cup of all time, the Netherlands drawed every match and finished their group tied in every criteria with the Republic of Ireland. So they drew lots to determine each nation's round of 16 opponent, and the Irish got Romania, while the Dutch got West Germany. They lost that infamous match fair and square, but considering they were favorites, maybe they could have gone further had they faced an easier side in the earlier rounds. Still, since their defeat was fair, I can't really complain too much about their luck in this edition. 4 years later, the Dutch traveled to the US, but once again, they had the misfortune of losing their best players before the start of the tournament. Dick Advocaat couldn't count with Van Basten and Ruud Gullit, and they were eliminated by Brazil. Once again, a bit unfortunate, but even with their best players, it would be really hard to beat either the Italian wall or the Brazilian beautiful football. Fast forward to France in '98 and the Dutch were brewing another golden generation. Davids, Bergkamp, Kluivert and many others gave hope to the country and went all the way to the semis, but they lost on penalties against Brazil in one of the most thrilling World Cup semi-finals of all time. Penalty shootouts are mostly about luck, but this Brazilian team was unmatched, and the only reason why they failed against France was because Ronaldo had suffered a seizure hours before the final. Either way, if anything, this serves as just another example that luck simply isn't on the orange side. Their last World Cup final until date would happen 12 years later in the iconic South Africa World Cup. Another decade had passed and the Dutch had primed yet another golden generation. Robben, Kout, Schneider and Van Persie were in the peak of their powers, but their squad was rather unbalanced, with the defense leaving a lot to be desired. Nevertheless, the Dutch proved their worth, beating everyone in their path to the final, including Uruguay and Brazil. There was only one team left to beat, another group of underachievers themselves who had been bamboozling everyone with their own approach to total football. Spain was playing tiki-taka and were favorites to win the trophy, but the Dutch had learned their lesson. 32 years ago, they lost their second consecutive World Cup final after committing to their attacking style of play, no matter who the opponents were. And after all these years, they had a chance to rewrite history. So what do? They play dirty. They don't open up too much to their opponents, but in the end... they still lost. From this point on, I made my mind and came to the conclusion that I will never see the Netherlands win a World Cup. If they couldn't do it when they had the best club, player and national team in the world, how do you expect them to win when their players leave the league before they even become stars? There's no identity in the Dutch squad anymore, Ajax is in shambles, and many nations are evolving at a much rapid pace than the Netherlands. To answer the question once and for all, are the Netherlands unlucky? Absolutely. There were way more instances where luck was against them than in favor of them, but their failures at the grandest stage aren't due to bad luck. It was their pure football beliefs that cost them their first 2 World Cup finals, and in their third attempt, they were simply outmatched by one of the best national team sides of all time. But what do you think? Are the Netherlands cursed or just bottlers? I know that my take might sound controversial, but if you don't agree, leave your own opinion in the comments and let's start the discussion. Don't forget to leave a like if you want to watch more content like this, and subscribe so you never miss the most interesting football discussions, stories and news. Thank you for watching until the end, I appreciate you, and I will see you soon.